To speak more on this, I do want to bring in criminal defense attorney Brian Claypool to our newsroom right here. And Brian, we appreciate you joining us here on Live Now from Fox.
Yeah, hey, Stephanie, great to see you again.
So Fox News is reporting that Maduro will appear at noon Eastern time in federal court in New York City. As we talk about the legal proceedings, can you walk us through what we can expect in federal court tomorrow?
Yeah, sure thing. So tomorrow is what's going to be called an arraignment. What is that? The federal judge is going to read the formal charges against Maduro and his wife. And then he's going to tell Maduro and his wife that you have a right to legal counsel. And my prediction here would be that a federal public defender will be appointed to represent Maduro and his wife tomorrow. And then I would say probably, a few days or maybe a week after that, you're going to see what's called a detention hearing. What's that? That's tantamount to a bail hearing. That's only going to take place after Maduro has legal counsel, right? Because he's got due process rights to have adequate legal representation. Once he has a public defender appointed, then they're going to get back into court. Lawyers are probably going to argue, hey, he should get bail. There's no chance in a million years that this federal judge will ever grant bail to Maduro and his wife. Why? Two reasons. They're clear flight risks, and then number two, they pose a risk of harm to others. And then walking it down a little bit further, then probably a few weeks after that, maybe a month or so, you're going to have another hearing, which is probably called a trial readiness conference, in which the judge will talk to the lawyers on both sides, the DOJ and his lawyers, and set a trial date for them. So that's how it looks.
So, Brian, I want to ask you this because, there might be differences or there might not, given the fact that he is not a U.S. citizen. When it comes to his defense team, is it going to be federally appointed, or would he possibly be able to hire his own attorneys?
Yeah, great question. This is a federal law violation. These are federal charges. So a federal, one or two, probably two. In federal court, you usually get more legal representation from public defenders than state court, because the charges are usually more serious and carry more jail time. But he's likely to get federal public defenders appointed. I thought about that. I mean, how's he going to access any money to pay for a defense lawyer, unless what we've seen in some high profile cases before, where a lawyer comes out from somewhere and wants to get some media attention and will agree to represent him free of charge. That could happen as well, but I don't see how he's going to be able to access a penny of any of his money to pay for a private lawyer.
We're taking a live look here outside of the Metropolitan Detention Center in Brooklyn, New York. This is where he and his wife are currently being held. When it comes to where Maduro will remain for the duration of these legal proceedings, will he continue to be held here in Brooklyn, or, what is that legal process when it comes to where you house someone, of this stature?
Yeah, so he's being held in Brooklyn, and that means that the federal trial is either going to take place in a Brooklyn federal courthouse or potentially in a Manhattan courthouse. I would suspect it's likely to be in a Manhattan federal courthouse. Why? Because the easier to have security. This case will have immense security. Remember, the P. Diddy the P. Diddy criminal trial took place in Manhattan as well, and they have a well-oiled, system in place to provide security during trial. So it's going to take place in Manhattan. And look, Stephanie, at the end of the day, I know people have been arguing, oh, this is not, how can we go in and do this to Maduro? Article 2, Section 2 of our U.S. Constitution makes it categorically clear that President Trump is deemed the commander-in-chief, and he, as well as many presidents before him, can go in and do what he did in the last couple of days because he is the commander-in-chief, and he's trying to protect the United States. This isn't like a Korean War or a Vietnam War, but this is a war against drugs that are killing people in the United States. I did a little bit of research, Stephanie. In 2020, they estimated in Venezuela 200 to 250 million tons of cocaine were transported to the United States annually for people to to use and potentially die.
Let's talk about the evidence that the prosecution will be presenting when it comes to the level of evidence. This is federal court. You know, what must the attorneys, the prosecutors outline in front of the court as evidence?
Yeah, it's important for your viewers to know this, Stephanie. This was a superseding indictment. That means that in 2020, Maduro was indicted in 2020. So the DOJ already had a mountain of evidence that they had gathered and procured to get an indictment. So, I mean, people make fun of indictments, but getting a federal indictment means you had to have ample evidence to show a grand jury that this guy needs indicted. And it was done in 2020. Nothing went forward legally because they didn't have him, right? They didn't have a person to bring to the United States to serve with the indictment. And we can't go, or we couldn't have had his government in Venezuela extradite him because he's running the government and it's allegedly a corrupt government. So that's important to note. In terms of evidence, I believe in 2020, the DOJ had some bank records from banks in Florida, is what I'm hearing. There might be some evidence of financial transactions taking place. Because remember, the argument here, to simplify for your viewers, a narco-terrorism act essentially means that Maduro had put together a terroristic group where he was using drug smugglers, he's protecting drug peddlers, right? They would go out and peddle the cocaine, fentanyl into other countries such as the US. They would then get the money, and then they sent money to Maduro. Hey, we're paying you to keep us safe from criminal prosecution. So that, in a nutshell, is what we're talking about here. But back to the evidence, you're going to be looking at electronic evidence. Phones, I'm sure, have been seized, any computers. And then also, like I said, financial records will be super important. And then remember, Stephanie, there were 14 other people in the original indictment in 2020. They're included in this indictment. Why is that important? Because you potentially have some other defendants that you might be able to access to testify against Maduro and his wife and his son to implicate them, and maybe they get some sort a plea deal. And then the last thing I'd want to mention is you probably have some undercover individuals from our intelligence agency that have been on this for years, that have been working undercover, who have probably gathered some incriminating evidence as well against Maduro and his wife.
There has been a lot of strong reaction, both in support of this and people who are opposing the capture of Maduro and his wife. When it comes to the issue of immunity, how does all of this play out within the U.S. legal system from a foreign head of state?
Well, he's not going to get immunity. He wasn't the foreign head of state. He was an illegitimate leader of Venezuela. He lost the election. So he's not going to get any kind of immunity for allegedly being the president of Venezuela. That's not happening in a million years. The only legal issue I could see his lawyers raising is extradition, right? They're going to, and don't be surprised if they come in here in the next few weeks and say, hey, Maduro is illegally extradited to the United States. Our counter, and then what they're going to say is, the extradition treaty in place, I think it was put in place in 1922, it states that you cannot extradite, somebody like Maduro. But our argument is very powerful and is likely to prevail. And that is what I mentioned a minute ago, which is this guy runs the government. This guy runs the military. He will go tell law enforcement and military in Venezuela, you can't arrest me. You can't extradite me because I run the country. And I'm going to harm you if you do that. So in other words, it's not like other countries where somebody's arrested, like say in Mexico, and then the Mexican officials work with us to get, alleged murderer sent back to the U.S. because they have a reasonable government in place. This guy is a tyrant. And I think the argument is going to prevail, whether it's a trial court level or this gets up to the U.S. Supreme Court, that we were allowed to extradite him because he literally controlled the entire political, military and legal process in Venezuela.
And Brian, as you mentioned, he was not officially recognized as the head of Venezuela. I'm curious, though, do you think that the defense could argue or will argue that Maduro cannot receive a fair trial because of all of the political attention. Is that an argument that they could legitimately try to make?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, Stephanie. I think that's an argument they will make because of the political, the bias, the alleged bias. I mean, let's face it. I mean, there's a mountain of evidence that he probably did this. But you're right. Look, this guy, no matter how much we hate him and his wife and his son, if they bring in his son, they are entitled under the Constitution to due process, Fourth Amendment. They need a fair trial. That's why he needs to have either a public defender or a private lawyer. That's why he's probably going to fight on extradition. That's why his lawyers are probably going to fight on some of the evidence, right? Think about that, Stephanie. We're going to have evidentiary issues too. You're going to have evidence maybe coming from a foreign country. Are there going to be hearsay issues with that? How do you authenticate that evidence? His team will make all those arguments. But look, I'm proud of our U.S. justice system. We have a lot of measures in place, Stephanie, to make sure that defendants get a fair trial. And what I mean by that is you're allowed to do copious questioning of potential jurors, right? And I've had some high-profile cases where I've been allowed to do what's called individual voir dire. What does that mean? Where you can literally take one juror, send all of the other prospective jurors out of the courtroom and question that one juror for 15, 20 minutes, a half hour, and find out what they know about Maduro. Have they watched the media? Do they have bias against him because he's an alleged drug peddler? And you have a way to narrow the jury pool to a group of individuals who do not have predisposed convictions about Maduro.
I also want to ask you this because you were mentioning Maduro's son is also one of the individuals charged. His wife is also charged, although specifically we don't know what she will be charged with. But how are cases like this handled when there are multiple family members involved?
Yeah, that's another great question because first of all, I don't know if you know, but I don't know whether the son has been captured and brought to the United States as well. I don't think he has, and that'll be important because you're not going to be able to move forward with the indictment against the son if he's not here. That's the first question. The second question leads to an interesting issue, which is, would Maduro get separate legal counsel? His wife is arguably going to need separate legal counsel because let's face it. I mean, who knows what their marriage is like, but maybe she's got some dirt on him that she now is going to be able to divulge to the Department of Justice lawyers. Maybe she gets a better deal, and that's used against Maduro to implicate him, to put him away for the rest of his life. That's why I think in this case you're going to see separate legal teams for each defendant. I think the judge will probably bring that up at the arraignment tomorrow.
Let's talk about legal precedent because that's always, what the judge takes a look at and what is argued in court. Is there legal precedent for a case such as this, and how might that potentially influence, the proceedings?
Well, there's two issues here. There's legal precedent as to whether President Trump and our military was allowed to go into Venezuela and capture Maduro and his wife. I think there's clear precedent categorically that he's legally permitted to do that. Now, the second question is, capturing him and then flying him to the United States, right? We talked a little bit about that, and bringing him and his wife here to the United States, potentially in violation of the Venezuelan extradition treaty. That really is the issue. And look, I'm not aware of anything that's happened like this, where you go to another country, right, and you capture, a high-ranking figure of that country, and then that government doesn't send the person back here. We physically bring that person back to our country. I think this could be a case of first impression with that. But that said, Stephanie, back to what I pointed out a few minutes ago, I believe there is precedent for a judge to rule that because Maduro allegedly controlled every aspect of Venezuela, it would be impossible to have that government extradite him to the United States to face charges. Therefore, that permits us to have done what we did. And I think that's ultimately what a judge will decide.
As we take a look at the upcoming proceedings, is there a particular facet of these legal proceedings that you are keeping a very close eye on?
Yeah, another good question. What I'd be looking at is the evidence to prove what's called a conspiracy. All four of these charges that you've mentioned, the narco, then conspiracy to distribute cocaine throughout the United States, conspiracy to have to send, weapons to the United States. It involves what's called a conspiracy. That crime, Stephanie, requires proof of an agreement between Maduro and somebody else. Here it's the cartels, right? Like I said, the FARC, F-A-R-C. You had I think the Simonella cartel group was mentioned as well. ELN was mentioned as well. So there's got to be some evidence of an agreement between Maduro and these cartel groups, right? For them to go out, sell cocaine, fentanyl, make money, send it back to him, right? But here's the good news. Usually in state court, for example, it's hard to prove the conspiracy because you need a written agreement, right? Usually in state court, you need some kind of writing that says there's an agreement between these parties to carry out these illicit acts. In federal court, thankfully, you can prove a conspiracy through inference or implication. In other words, through the behavior of Maduro, of the cartel groups, and prove their pattern of behavior of peddling drugs to the United States. And that will be enough to satisfy the element for a conspiracy. That's the real issue I'm going to be paying attention to. How do they prove that pattern of behavior, the movement of the cartel groups, and then also the movement of the money, right, Stephanie? That's going to be something you need to look at. Do we actually have some of those financial records in the Florida banking system to prove that the money was flowing back to Maduro?
And all of that is going to play out in court. But to one of your original points is that even to get to this point, there has to be solid evidence. The U.S. government isn't going to go ahead with the case if they don't have hard evidence against the person that they are indicting. So it's going to be very interesting to see how all of this plays out. No doubt, Brian, we are going to be bringing you back in as we continue to follow all of these proceedings. Maduro, again, will be in court tomorrow, federal court, so no cameras inside, but we're going to get more information as all of that comes out. Brian, we thank you for your time.
You bet. Thanks for having me, Stephanie.